Okay. So we're going to get started. Just a reminder, if you've just logged in, go ahead and mute yourself if I haven't already muted you. Appreciate that very much. So today we are going to talk about why frogs are special, why they are important. We'll talk a bit about the different amphibians themselves and do a little visual ID kind of slide and look at the characteristics of the different frogs that live here in Maine. And we'll also talk about their songs and how to identify them by song. We'll talk about their habitat. So different frogs, different species of frogs do tend to be found in different habitats, so we can make use of that in terms of both finding them and also protecting them in terms of conservation. How we observe frogs, there's some tricks to that as well. What we can do to protect frogs and some resources to help you both learn more about the frogs in Maine and also to be able to participate in some projects that are going on to survey frogs in the state of Maine. This is being recorded and a link will be sent to you after the program, so you can share that link with other folks if you wish to. You can also review the program if there was something you missed or you want to revisit something. So Father's Day is coming, not too far away. So that was what sparked the connection to the cartoon there. So a little bit about the importance of frogs. And one reason why we make a point of talking about this is because a lot of species of frogs, over 200 of them, have gone extinct worldwide since 1970. So why does this matter? Well, frogs are very important for a number of reasons. Just their having these species is an important part and a very important element of biodiversity in our, not just our wetlands, but also in our forests, because frogs are found also in forests. And the resiliency of that population is largely dependent on that biodiversity. So um, they're also important because they have the potential for pharmaceuticals for humans. And in fact, there are a number of pharmaceuticals that are already under development that have been found in frogs. They are an important bioindicator because they are so sensitive. They breathe in part through their skin. And so as a result, they absorb lots of whatever's around them. So they're quite sensitive. So they can be a bioindicator to let us know if there are potential hazards, pollution, and other risks that we're undertaking. And so we can use them as a bioindicator species. They are important distributors of nutrients because they have this dual life where they're born in the water and then they go out either in migration across the landscape. Some of them hibernate in the woods and then return to the wetlands. And so in the process of doing that, they are distributing nutrients, whether it is a frog that gets eaten in the woods by a raccoon and thus is now contributing to the nutrients that are in the woods, or whether it's a blue heron that comes to the wetland and eats a frog and then migrates. So they're an important part of the food web, and they are distributing carbon and nutrients all throughout the landscape. One thing that folks don't necessarily think of is they're also important algae control because tadpoles are, some of them, depending on the species, eat a variety of things, but one of the primary food for many tadpoles is algae. And at this time, when we're really concerned about the amount of phosphorus, for example, that gets into lakes and ponds and streams, and its contribution to creating algae blooms, we need whatever help we can get to control algae in, especially in those streams and ponds and lakes that have sensitivity to a lot of nutrients that are coming into them or are at risk because when there's a lot of development, you have septic systems and lawn treatment, for example, that may be entering the waterways and causing algae blooms. And every bit of help we can get from tadpoles to help control that algae is going to be important um, with respect to water quality. So what are frogs impacted by? A lot worldwide, habitat loss is the biggest contributor to their populations, and that's true in Maine as well. So whether it is habitat loss because wetlands have been filled in or mismanaged with respect to wildlife, or whether it's roads that are now not available or creating hazards on their migration routes. Disease is an issue for frogs. There have been some specific diseases that have been documented. There are some fungal diseases and so forth. And because of the fairly global nature of our world today, some of those diseases have moved from one continent to another, one region to another, and that has impacted not just frogs, but also other animals, but particularly frogs. Frogs are sensitive to climate change because they do have this life where they are both in the water and on the land, and they have specific needs. And so, for example, spring peepers, when water gets warm, they can't reproduce. And so, whether it's climate change or a combination of climate change and lack of vegetation providing shade around ponds, the frogs are susceptible to that. In some places, predatory invasive fish or other species have posed significant threats to frogs, and also in some places, commercial trade for food and pets. There is a pet trade for certain frogs and toads, and then of course pollution. And so that's quite an assemblage of risks that frog populations are under, and it is significant, but particularly habitat and climate change in this region. So when we meet the frog, when we're in elementary school, most of us meet the frog when we learn in first grade maybe about its life cycle and metamorphosis. And it's really a very extraordinary adaptation to survival. And one of the things that I certainly never learned from my grade school teachers, but I discovered later, is that metamorphosis is specifically a survival strategy so that the adults are not competing with the young for food. So the young are born in the water, as we know, and they are eating primarily algae, but other foods as well in the water. But the adults are not eating that food whatsoever. The adults are traveling across the landscape, or they're in the water, but they're eating insects. And so there's not that no competition, which is sort of a really remarkable strategy for survival, especially when you consider the potential risks for tadpoles where they are not protected by an adult for the most part. There are some species, especially of tropical frogs, that are protected by the adult. The adult will carry the tadpoles for a period of time in jungle conditions, but not here. So let's meet the frogs that live in Maine. On the upper left of my screen, in number 1 is the wood frog, and that frog is most discernible by the mask that goes from the eye down to the almost to its arm, and that dark. And the frog itself can be different shades of tan, brown, almost a yellowy color. They are the frog of the vernal pools. These are the temporary pools that we find in the woodlands at this time of year that are the result of runoff and rain in the spring. And these pools tend to dry out later in the season. And so these frogs need to go through a very fast reproductive cycle where they're laying eggs, the eggs hatch and develop into fully formed frogs, generally within about 2 weeks. And so it's really a race against time, because if that vernal pool dries up before the frog has fully developed its legs and capacity to move around on the land, then it won't make it. So it's a pretty extraordinary frog, and it has a very fast life cycle. So we're just going to go through these and give you a little bit more of an introduction to each of these frogs. And the number 2 there is a spring peeper. And oops, sorry about that. Let me go back. That's not what I meant to do. Oops. Sorry, there we go. So number 2 is the spring peeper, and it's got that X across its back. That is the defining characteristic. These are a very small variety of, they're actually a tree frog, and if you look closely at its little toes, each one has a little suction cup for climbing, and they use that primarily to climb on vegetation along the edge of the waterways. The spring peeper is one of the ones that's making very noisy racket right now. It's certainly what I hear, even when you're driving 40 miles an hour with the window open on a balmy evening. These frogs are the ones, and we'll go through the songs and calls in a few minutes so you can hear what those are and discuss the different sounds so that you can identify them. The spring peeper is very sensitive, like I said, to water temperatures, and so I lived in the Twin Cities and Minneapolis area for a while, and this spring peepers, even though there are lots of lakes in the Twin Cities, the spring peepers were extirpated because what happened was they cleared all around the ponds and lakes in the Twin Cities region and made them into mowable lawnscapes right up to the very edge of the water. And what happened was there was no vegetation for these frogs to reproduce in, and there was very little shade available along the edges of the waters. And so these frogs died out in that region. So there's been a concerted effort, I think, since then to make amends, but I don't know if there are spring peepers in that area at this point. So number 3, that kind of mottled looking frog, that's the mink frog. It is a very rare frog to come across in Maine. Very, very few of these frogs are found. I will play some of the calls and so forth again so you get a sense of what they sound like. But the defining characteristics, this is a medium-sized frog, and it has these very irregular shaped blobs and mottled colors, the dark on the lighter gray-green colors. Number 4 is the gray tree frog. This frog actually can change color, and so while it's called a gray tree frog, it is also sometimes a mint green, sometimes it's a tan brown. It has these large patches of mottled colors on it, and it has suction cups on its toes. This is the frog that you tend to hear when it is humid out in, July, sometimes in June, but mostly in July and August to some degree. And these frogs will call from the trees, and they'll call back and forth. A lot of times people don't realize that they're frogs even because it's so unexpected in some respects, but they are a beautiful little frog. Number 5 in the middle there is the American toad. American toads are types of frogs. They are the brownish gray color with these glands that are that stick up underneath the skin, and so they've got that bubbled look to them, and that's how you identify an American toad. Of course, a lot of us know them because we tend to find them in the garden or under the deck, or they're not strictly aquatic. They are very much on the land, and they'll burrow into moist soil and eat grubs and insects, and generally help out gardens tremendously. So they're a great asset right on your yard. The next frogs I kind of wanted to give you a sense of what we only have the northern leopard frog. We don't have the plains leopard frog or the southern leopard frog, but just to show you that there are different leopard frogs in different locations. And this isn't the best quality photograph, I realize, but the leopard frog as compared to the pickle frog, these can be a little hard to tell apart. I will say that the northern leopard frog is far more common than the pickerel frog, which is not common at all in this area right now. Pickerel frogs actually seem to have gone through a steep decline throughout the continent, throughout their range, I should say. And the pickerel frog has had, there's been a number, it's the one that was really most famous for the deformities that were found starting in the 80s, and that does continue in this population of frogs through today. I don't, there's been a number of possible reasons why the deformities have been found, and what the full impact is on these populations, we don't really know. But the way to tell these frogs apart, aside from their calls, which are quite different, is that the northern leopard frog has these um, uh, blotches, spots that are, a little unevenly distributed throughout over its back and sides and legs and so forth. While the pickle frog has very discernible two lines down its back of larger, more rectangular spots. And so when you see them in these pictures, they do look quite different. And the northern leopard frog can get quite a bit bigger than the pickle frog, although they are sometimes the same size, of course, too. Okay. And two additional species that was helpful to have this comparison pictures, the American bullfrog and the northern green frog, both of which are common here. The bullfrog is the most delayed in coming out of hibernation, or really it's a brumation for frogs. And when they come out, it's just a little bit later than the other species. So if you're out and about this spring, you may find the northern green frog first, is most likely. The way to discern these two species, if you look at the ridge that goes from behind the eye, with the American bullfrog, that ridge goes behind the eye, loops down behind the tympanum, which is their organ for sensing reverberations, and essentially an ear, although it doesn't function quite like an ear. So the bullfrog, that ridge behind the eye and around the behind the tympanum, goes down directly towards the leg, and there's no ridge the length of its body. But the northern green frog, the ridge goes from behind the eye, and then a part of it continues straight down the back of the frog from behind the tympanum, although there is a piece that also loops around the tympanum. And this is also a useful comparison photograph, because in most species of frogs, although I don't think in all of them, the tympanum actually indicates whether it's a male or a female. So if the tympanum is bigger than the eye, then it's a male. And if the tympanum is smaller than the eye, it's a female frog. So let's talk a little bit about the different calls of these frogs. No doubt you're familiar with them, and you'll recognize them as soon as you hear them, or hear them described even. And I will try in a moment to bring up a website where we can play some of them. But just to go through, so the spring peepers are that chorus of shrill peeps that we hear in the wetlands, especially at night. They are primarily nocturnal. And so while you'll find the spring peepers occasionally in the daytime, they're really active, breeding, setting up territories and so forth at night. Green frogs are the one that sound like a banjo being plucked. Again, primarily nocturnal. Pickle frogs, it sounds like a comb tine with a finger running over it. Leopard frogs do a low rumbling snore or grunt. Bullfrogs, a bellowing cow, which isn't what at all we would necessarily think of a frog, but mink frogs are interesting. They have a sort of a series of taps, which sound like hooves on cobblestones when you have a whole bunch of them together. And wood frogs are that quacking duck noise. American toads are a long trill that goes up in the end. So let me, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and go to a different screen so that I can, one moment, whoops. I just want to bring up a screen with some frogs. One moment. So I want to play some of these for you so that you'll be able to hear them. Can you hear that?
Yes.
Okay, do you know what frogs those are?
Peepers.
Spring peepers, exactly right. Okay, good. Spring peepers. So there's the trill, and those are the males. So those are the males calling to the females in chorus. So spring peepers we're largely familiar with because they are so common in every wetland around here. So just for comparison, because they're also a trilling frog, is the American toad. So here we go.
Sound like a cone.
That is also American toad, that little beeping noise. I don't know what they're saying to each other, but they do have some different calls. So those are both American toad, and that
The one
the
that was
first,
going doot, 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 that was
Yep.
an American toad too.
yes,
Okay, thank you.
exactly. Yeah, sure. So the first one was that long, very steady trill that sort of doesn't oscillate at all, very consistent. So that's the primary call. Here is the gray tree frog. For some comparison, this is a totally different type of call, and this is the one we often hear in the late part of the summer from trees.
Mm.
And now this is actually two frogs calling back and forth to each other. So one's in one tree and one's in the other. So how would you folks describe that call?
Sort of a trill.
Yeah, it's kind of a trill, like it's a trill underwater, but the frog's not underwater. All right, great. Let me go through a few more of these for comparisons. Oops, so now I have to turn that one off. Stop. All right, let's see if you recognize this one. It's pretty soft. Can you hear that?
No.
Barely hear it.
Yeah, it's not a good recording. I'm sorry. Oh wait, here we go. Let's try that.
Oh, croak, 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 croak.
Yep, that's the green frog.
He almost says croak.
It does almost say croak. Yeah.
Croak, croak, croak.
Yep. Kind of a banjo kind of a croak. And here's a mink frog. This is the one that does the tapping. Has anyone ever heard that in this group?
No.
No.
Yeah. I don't think most people would know it was a frog if they did hear it.
No, I think it was a bird.
Here's one you should recognize, I suspect. Oops. What's this one? This is the duck quacking one.
Yeah.
This is the wood frog.
I never heard one wood frog.
I know. So they're definitely calling now, I hear them in the woods. I hear them, in like little pools in the woods and the vernal pools and stream sides right now. They are quite active. Here's the leopard frog. This is the one that grunts and groans. So it does that loud tapping thing and then it grunts and groans.
Sounds like a woodpecker first.
Yeah, yeah. And here's a pickerel frog with peepers in the background. It's a little confusing. You'd be very fortunate to hear that. I have not heard it ever, I don't think. Let me crank up the volume a little bit and see if I can play it for you. Let's see. Oh, no, it's not playing loud enough for me. Sorry. Okay. Well, let's go back to the, can you see my shared screen again? Great. So let's just talk a little bit about habitat, because different frogs can be found in different habitats: ponds, marshes, lakes, streams, wet woods, vernal pools. And so if you're out looking for frogs or looking for a specific species, it does certainly help to know where to look. And so all these frogs are going to wetlands at this time of year and into the early part of the summer to breed. And so you may see them in migration, emerging from the woods, for example, in the case of the wood frog, and going to a pool of water in the forest, sometimes crossing roads, unfortunately, to do that. You may also find the frogs themselves in the wetlands. So most of these frogs are kind of generalists, like the green frog, and they'll make use of lots of different types of water bodies. One exception to that is the leopard frog and also the pickle frog. They both like streams and colder waters, and so you may find some variation there. The primary frogs of the vernal pools are the wood frogs, occasionally spring peepers, and sometimes toads. I want to talk a moment about vernal pools because they are a really special type of wetland, and people often disregard them or may not even know that they're there. If you've moved into a property and you don't realize that you've got some wet woods where you've got pools at this time of year, you walk back there and there may be some pools in the woods that are going to dry out in the summertime. And the wood frog, like the frog over on the left with the mask, is a frog that will use the vernal pools. For these animals that use the vernal pools, it's a really great habitat in that there won't be fish there to consume the young. And so that's the advantage to seeking out a vernal pool as compared to, say, a marsh or a pond or a lake where there are going to be some of those larger predators. So the wood frogs will lay their eggs usually in clumps, just like it's shown, amongst the grasses and other vegetation in the vernal pool. And the way to tell the clumps of frog eggs as compared to clumps of salamander eggs is that the frog eggs are, each individual embryo has a mass of jelly around it, but the salamander eggs has an additional large area of jelly-like material around the whole mass. So you've got the embryos in a cluster, and then you've got another mass of jelly around the outside when you were talking about the spotted salamanders, for example. But the frogs don't have that. It's just individual embryos with jelly around them clumped together. The toads their eggs are pretty distinctive because if you can look at the top image there, you'll see that they're chains of eggs that are in strands and will be usually intertwined with vegetation. And you may find those in ponds and also vernal pools. So let's talk a little bit about some of the different things we can all do for frogs and conservation measures that we can take, whether we're um, in our neighborhood or with respect to maybe municipal projects that can happen through conservation committees or groups of citizens. So one of the things that we can all do is protect wetland habitat, and whether that's on your own property or municipal property or um, areas, for example, like uh, um, beaches and things like that along that are state parks and so forth. There are ways that we can all get involved in protecting wetland habitat in protected areas. So helping at road crossings at this time of year is a great project. And there is this program, the website that is shown on the right-hand side of the screen it says pools and people, and it's actually the website is vernalpools.me/big night. And I'll talk more about what they do, but this is a group of folks who are actively engaged in recruiting volunteers to help amphibians of all sorts successfully make it across the roads when they're in migration routes. So they can't, the frogs and salamanders and so forth, they are they're in migration when it's over 50 degrees usually, or just over 50 in the spring, and it's raining. Those are ideal times for them to be migrating because they can cross areas that are not generally wet, and their skin will remain wet so that they can be healthy and not dry out. But of course that endangers them when they're crossing the roads. So big night is it varies a little bit, obviously, as to where you are, as to what night is big night. But big night happens every spring. It's sometimes a couple of different nights. And it's when all the amphibians and salamanders, including salamanders, are moving into pools, vernal pools and so forth, in order to mate and reproduce and lay eggs. And so volunteers go out to help them cross the roads. And this is partly organized by this group in Maine. So you could also do it without being part of the group. If you have a roadside kind of project just near your home, if you know there are amphibians out and about, you can help cross. Just maybe wear some reflective gear. And whenever you handle amphibians, we handle them as little as possible because they do absorb everything that we have on our hands. And so if you have bug spray or sunscreen or hand lotion or anything at all, it'll permeate their skin, and so that's not good for them. So I encourage people to use a bucket and coax them into the bucket. Wear your orange gear with reflective tape, and help the amphibians, just let them go across the street in whatever direction they're headed. Joining the frogs census effort, there are some national efforts to census frogs, and there's also this group here, this Vernal Pools Maine, the Big Night group. They also are involved in a census effort to document where frogs are, what species are where. And then using fewer pesticides and herbicides on our lawns and in our landscape will obviously protect all amphibians, as well as insects and other creatures. Another thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about, and even though we don't all own Shoreline, we all are, or most of us anyway, we're near it some of the time. And it's helpful to be able to, if I, as an instructor, look at all of you as ambassadors for this information, I fully hope that you will share this information with anybody who either owns Shoreline or is talking about Shoreline. So some of the things that are best for amphibians are the most natural shorelines, and with vegetation, like the image in the middle where you have vegetation that's emerging. It's called emergent vegetation, where it's growing on the bottom of the pond or lake and it comes up out of the water. That's where the frogs and tadpoles and so forth they're safest from predators. It's where they're going to find the most food. That top right hand picture where there's some frog eggs that are right in with the vegetation that's very consistent with what you'll generally find. If you look at those images on the left, you've got a barren lawn, rocky shoreline that's it's probably been put there because they didn't want to have erosion from waves or boat traffic, but as a result, that's not habitat for frogs, and so they would have been better to plant vegetation, allow the lawn to grow up, and make sure there's shade for peepers and emergent vegetation for frogs laying eggs. And the other thing that happens is if you don't protect the shoreline and you mow right to the shore, like the bottom picture shows, you will eventually get erosion, whether it's from waves, from wind, or from boat traffic. And once you get erosion, then that soil is being deposited right into the waterway. And as it does that, it's going to smother any vegetation that's in the water. And then the frogs and other animals that are in the water are not going to have the proper type of habitat. So you need to have water that's clear enough that the sunlight can get down to the bottom, especially on the edges. That sunlight should be able to penetrate the shore. But if there's a lot of suspended sediment from erosion, then it may physically smother the vegetation, or it may just make it so that the vegetation isn't getting sunlight. And then at our homes, don't vacuum up the woods. So those leaves are important holders of moisture. They are stopping raindrops from collecting pollutants and running into the water. They're providing habitat, hiding places for frogs and salamanders and insects that they survive on. Leaving logs and debris as best as you can will help to nourish the forest and provide habitat for these animals. It'll slow runoff and protect water quality as well. One of the resources that is the best book around on reptiles and amphibians in Maine is this book that's shown here, and it comes with a CD actually. So if you didn't get a good listen to the songs and calls that I was trying to play for you today, that would be one way. There are a number of websites that have calls and songs as well. And then that website that I shared with you is vernalpools.me, and they do a lot of conservation work, including using volunteers to monitor frog populations and help frogs and salamanders cross the roads during migration. So that's what I had to share with you today in the way of a presentation. So I'm curious what types of questions you folks have. So I'm going to look through the chat and see if anyone put questions there, but you're also welcome to unmute yourselves and feel free to ask questions. Somebody asked, where's the best place to find gray tree frogs? Oh, is that Eve or is that Eve's mom on that computer? Anyway, I think it's probably Liz, but anyway, when you're looking for gray tree frogs in the woods, or sometimes they're out on the lawn in a tree, and what you want to do is find usually it's a mid-sized tree to a large tree, and where that tree has a trunk that splits or branches that come off so that there's a pocket where there's moisture. It may even have moss growing right in the crevice of the tree or a little pool of water after the rain. That is the best place to find the gray tree frogs. They are extremely hard to find. They're very well camouflaged, and it's not that easy to, even when you hear the call loud and clear, it's not that easy. And of course, sometimes they're quite high up. They do crawl very successfully quite high up into the tree, partly so their song is carried. A lot of people tend to find them when they're stuck to the front door on the screen or something. They'll also climb houses occasionally, especially if you have a shady side of the house. So, great question. Oh, Eve and the boyfriend. Good to know. Nice to see you, Eve. We live in Alna. We have a very small pond, fed by an intermittent stream with human-made dam back in the 50s. We had tons of turtles, herons, kingfishers, etc. Most especially, we had tons of frogs all over our lawn. 10 years ago, the dam broke and all that wonderful microhabitat went away. No more frogs. DEP, EPA will not let us fix the dam. Any ideas? That's a great question. So, yeah, there's a lot of limitations on what you can do, obviously, with respect to building things in wetlands. Is generally, the idea is to keep the wetlands as intact as we can. So I guess well, one way to do it be, if you have aspens in the area, you may eventually get beavers, and beavers will recreate that pond in a moment, and then your pond will come back. So you can hope for beavers. That would be one solution. They'll also make a nice pond with all the habitat you're talking about, and that would be the natural succession of things, because in a natural world, beavers are a big part of our environment, and they will come wherever there is food. So one solution might be to have aspens, which is one of their favorite foods. Other than that, I don't think there is anything probably you can do to recreate that type of habitat. So I'm not sure that there is a solution to that. And unfortunately, the frogs that tend to live in cool streams are not our most common frogs, so there won't be very many of them. So another person asks about finding frog eggs and taking them home to catch and re-release once they're mature. And lots of kids do this, of course, and so she's asking, well, what's the best way to do this? How can you make sure that you're taking frog eggs that are going to survive and help them, and then release them? So the best way to do that is to take the frog eggs carefully in a bucket and not handle them at all, and put them into a terrarium, and then exchange the water very regularly, maybe every other day, with the same water that comes from that same pool that the eggs came from. And you should have good luck. They'll hatch if you don't handle them, and they will persist for a period of time. I would make sure that you actually, there is, you can purchase food to feed them, but it's not a good idea to do that, because you're actually introducing material to them that they're not wouldn't normally find in the wild. And so your best bet is to release them before they've started to really grow legs, and unless you're exchanging the water super often. In the water, they should find plenty to eat, so that there'll be algae and so forth. So if you're able to exchange the water often, they should be fine. Oh, so this is a good question. I didn't review how frogs survive the winter, and so I touched on it, but I didn't thoroughly discuss it. So the wood frog in particular is one that has a little bit of a different kind of a habit. It goes out into the woods. It burrows under logs and leaves, which is another reason to leave them in your woods and in your yards. And it burrows not even all that deep, maybe a couple inches down. And it actually can allow parts of its cells to freeze, because it has a glucose compound in it, so that the important parts of the cells do not freeze and explode. And so it's partially a frozen frog, and it spends that way through the winter. It's turned its metabolism off. It's barely functional. It's certainly not eating. It's not digesting. Its heart is barely beating, and it is able to conserve energy through the entire winter, emerge in the spring, and go off into the wetlands to reproduce, which is pretty extraordinary. Most of our other frogs, well, not toads, but the other frogs are going down into the mud at the bottom of a pond or a lake or a marsh, and they're not freezing because they're down in an environment where they're protected by below the frost line, essentially below the water. So you'll have ice on top of the lake, but then there's water, and then there's the muddy bottom, and they are down in the muddy bottom for the duration. They will move around a little bit. The green frogs in particular will move around a little bit in the wintertime underneath the ice and so forth, but not a lot. They're mostly conserving energy. They're not eating. They actually they get down in the mud, and because frogs breathe through their skin, but they're in the mud, they're not able to respirate that well. So they start absorbing oxygen. They develop special glands in their armpits so that they can breathe through their armpit areas and be able to absorb oxygen that's trapped in the mud that way. And they'll spend the duration of the winter down there, and then emerge in the spring to continue their life cycle in the marshes and ponds and so forth. If you touch a partially frozen frog, will it freeze totally and die? No, no, I don't. They're very fragile at that point. I mean, you wouldn't really want to handle one, but yes, you could touch it, and I don't think it would make a difference to the frog. You'd be hard pressed to find one. I don't know if has anyone here ever found a frozen frog? I'm sure that people have, but they're pretty, good at hiding themselves. They get down into the forest stuff and under logs and so forth, and they're hard to find. Oh, Eve says she found a frozen toad right under the leaf litter. Did you touch it, Eve? That's great. Yes. That's great. What is the difference between frogs and toads? Another person asks. Well, a toad is a type of frog. The toads around here are the American toad, and it has that bumpy skin because it has glands under its skin, and the glands can excrete a nasty material that is intended to fend off predators. So if you go and try to eat a live toad, it will excrete its toxic chemicals out of its glands, and then you'll be sure to spit it out quickly. So it's very effective. They also, of course, will pee on you, which helps, or in your mouth if you were eating it. So they're pretty. A toad doesn't have a lot of defense, but that's fairly effective, I think. I certainly wouldn't eat another one after that. And incidentally, pickle frogs also have a toxic material or substance that they can excrete out of their skin. And there have been cases, for example, where people were collecting frogs in buckets either for observation or entertainment, and they went to their bucket and found that all the frogs except the pickle frog was dead because the other frogs are susceptible to the toxins in the pickle frog's skin. So and it is toxic to humans as well. People get rash reactions from it as well. Oh yeah, so somebody's commenting that she saw a frog or toad swimming below the ice. Probably it was a frog. The toads tend to be in the woods, but it was below the ice in a pool in the winter in New York State. Yeah, and sometimes when you do have that very clear ice in the wintertime, you can occasionally see frogs moving around, but they don't tend to move around much, is my understanding. Great.
I have can you hear me? I have a question.
Go right ahead.
Late. I'm sorry, I was locked behind a gate, but what is the health of the amphibians on the coast?
So
area. I'm in the mid-coast area.
Yeah, I am too. I don't think there's been a good census of frog populations in this area for a long time. So either in terms of health, in terms of their physical health and well-being, I don't have good data on that, and I don't know of anybody who's collected recent data. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I haven't found it. And Maine Audubon had been doing a survey just on populations, but I don't think it was super active in this area. So I don't fully know the answer to that, and I don't know the full answer to, if your question was more about sort of the numbers you know, how the populations are doing in terms of quantities of frogs. Unfortunately, I don't think anyone is doing a concentrated study. However, I did actually just get an email from somebody that I haven't had a chance to respond to. Somebody who is starting to do some kind of survey work in this area. So I'll follow up on that and see if that's going to be an ongoing project or if it's a temporary effort. I'm not sure. So,
And are the numbers, I mean, is it cyclical? Like some year you'll have more peepers than others, or like last year was kind of not a good year for the frogs in my pond.
yeah, I mean, certainly you can have, well, first of all populations are cyclical, and that's one reason why ecologists have such a hard time. You know, they have to collect data over years because you can't just say, oh, well, this is, you know, snowshoe hares are this, you know, kind of quantity, and the next year they're this kind of quantity. But so yes, they're cyclical and changing, but you know, they should stay within certain parameters. Otherwise, you get too few or too many, and that's what I really don't have a good handle on in terms of the populations themselves. So it's a really good question, and I think that I'll be kind of checking out to see if there is somebody who's interested in doing that kind of work in the near future.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sarah,
Yes.
did you see my message about the white toad or frog? I didn't realize I didn't put my name on it.
You
So
don't have to.
Oh, it's there. I'm sorry. I missed a few of these. I'm just looking at this. She says, I found and photographed a pure white frog, toad, question mark, sitting on a leaf, evidently sunning itself, unable to ID it. And when I left and came back, it was gone. Any idea? I could take a guess if you want to share the photograph at some point, and just based on its shape and, for example, the ridge on its back or not having a ridge on its back, the shape of the nose is sometimes helpful in identifying, you know, the overall shape of the head can be helpful. So that's super interesting. I've not heard of that happening. You know, do you think, did it have a pink eye? I mean, was it albino or was it lutistic?
I think it was snoozing.
Huh.
Near the water at all. It wasn't anywhere near the water.
Well, so was it kind of pudgy when it was sitting there?
Yes.
Yeah, it sounds like a gray tree frog. And they are the ones that can change color. And so I can believe that they could be a super light tone of gray. And they are a pudgy little frog that will snooze. And you kind of, you know, you might wake one up, but other than that, they tend to they're more active. They're crepuscular, dawn and dusk, sometimes the late afternoon, but yeah, so offhand I would guess gray tree frog, but if you want to share a picture at some point,
Yeah,
my email's available.
Thank you. I will send you a picture.
Sure. Great. Let's see.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes. How do you tell the difference between salamander eggs and frog eggs?
Yep. So that's a good one because it can be hard to tell. But basically, the frog eggs are individual embryos with the jelly around, and then all of those individual embryos with the jelly are in a mass together. Whereas a salamander cluster is going to be individual embryos with jelly and then a larger mass of jelly around that whole mass of embryos. And in fact, that mass of jelly that's on the exterior most mass of jelly will slowly start to separate from the eggs themselves as the egg cluster ages. And so that's your best way of telling them apart.
I'm sorry, do they cohabitate in the same pond?
Yes, frequently. Yeah.
Thank you.
And
Sure.
those salamander egg masses, they can turn whitish.
Okay.
Yeah, they can. They don't always. They can also turn greenish. There's a couple of different algae that will have they actually have a relationship, like a symbiotic relationship with the developing embryos of the salamanders, which is kind of
The ones
interesting.
that I'm talking about were bluish.
Yep. Yeah, the range, the color, unfortunately, isn't a good key identifier because the coloration can change. It can vary. It first of all varies over time, and it isn't specific to a type of animal. So both frogs and salamanders can be grayish or whitish or greenish masses. So you
Thank you.
want to look more for the structure of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Great. Let's see if I've missed any other questions. Feel free to speak up if I did.
I have a question. Again, I missed the beginning of your
That's fine.
presentation. I apologize, but how many different kinds of salamanders do we have here? We've
Oh,
got
that's a good question.
the-
Yeah, we have spotted ones. We have red Fs, which are the ones that are the little orange ones that you see crossing the road. That's actually their middle stage, their adolescent stage. Then you have the Jeffersonian salamander, and you have the there's a variety, the oh, what's it called? There's the name isn't coming to me right now. There's one that actually will interbreed with the Jefferson salamander, and then there is the redback salamander, and that's the most common one. That's the little dark colored one that, like, when you turn over logs in the woods, they have red orangey stripes to them.
Okay.
And that, I think, is it. So the big purpley ones with the yellow spots and the Jefferson salamanders, and the hybrid variety, those ones are all in the group of mole salamanders, and they're called that because they will go in the wintertime or actually in the summer as well. They'll use mole tunnels and chipmunk tunnels, and they'll go down into the tunnels and eat little grubs and so forth. And so they're not really digging or excavating their own tunnels, but they'll go into other people's tunnels and use them, which I don't know, I find that kind of amusing somehow.
Thank you.
Sure. I would say for most people, I think are most familiar with the red F salamander because that's the one that has the kind of tail that looks like a fin in its adult stage, and they're super common in ponds and lakeshore environments. And then you see the orange red F stage when it's walking around. And those are toxic, not that you would eat one, but when birds try to eat them, they have a toxin in them as well.
Hmm.
So don't eat orange salamanders. Oh, red spotted newt. So that's another name for it. It's another colloquial name, but I know them as red Fs. Yeah. Same thing though. Oh, goodbye, Kelly. It was nice to have you join us. Great. Blue spotted. That is correct, Jermaine. Good job. It was not coming to me. You're right. That's the other one that can hybridize with the Jefferson. All right. Well, I think it's probably time for everybody to have dinner or whatever the next stage is. And I really am thrilled that so many folks could come on and talk about frogs. I didn't expect that at all, honestly, when I proposed this talk. So there's a lot more frog lovers than I would have guessed, and it's lovely to have you all join. So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
have a great evening, and if you stay tuned to our website for more programs.